This is the second screencast of the history and globalization of English theme, and it will deal with the period from around 500 to around 1100, specifically about what we call Old English. So, after the Romans left, the Celtic people living in Britain had a lot of trouble with tribes from north of where they lived. For example, Scots and another group called the Picts. So a Celtic warlord decided to ask some Germanic people to come live in Britain if they would then defend it against attacks from the north. This resulted in the arrival of three different groups. The Angles from Anglia in Germany, the Saxons from Saxony, also in Germany, and lastly the Jutes from Jutland in Denmark. And we can see here on the map how they traveled there and where they settled. Now, it was only the Jutes, actually, which were originally invited. The Angles and the Saxons, they just decided on their own to travel there and start settling a few decades later. And we can see on the map here, around the year 800, how the British Isles had been settled. The three pink areas are dominated by Angles. The two skin-colored ones are dominated by Saxons, and Kent is dominated by Jutes. These people spoke a West Germanic language, which was different from the Celtic language, and so these Germanic tribes actually ended up colonizing most of Britain, like we can see on the map there. Not a lot of area left. The invaders pushed the Celts out, so the Celts ended up dominating along with the Scots and the Picts in the green areas. So Scotland, Ireland, and Wales. And as I said, these Germanic tribes, they formed what became 7 different kingdoms. Essex, Wessex, and Sussex, belonging to the Saxons. East Anglia, Mercia, and Northumbria, belonging to the Angles. And Kent, belonging to the Jutes. It is impossible to sort of pinpoint, specify a specific time when English became a separate language. But this new nation, this new Anglo-Saxon nation, that's what it's called after the Angles and the Saxons, it became known as the land of the Angles, or England, and its new language became known as English. Today we refer to it as Old English. So it started as a dialect, a form of these Germanic languages spoken by the tribes, but as they became isolated in Britain, they started to develop their own features from the continental Germanic language spoken in Europe. That's sort of around the year 600. Something important in Old English is the coming of Christianity. a missionary called Saint Augustine, uh, and the people traveling with him brought Christianity to Britain in the year 597. So this started a process where Britain was converted to Christianity, and monasteries and churches were being built. Missionaries introduced the new Roman alphabet, which replaced the old Celtic and Anglo-Saxon rune alphabets. So this new alphabet was adopted, but some old runes were added to the alphabet for certain sounds that simply didn't exist in Latin, such as the thorn or the eth. Both of those were used for the modern th sound. And Latin at this time was only used to educate the ruling classes. Old English was still the language of most of the population, but certain church ceremony related words started to enter the language. These languages, these words are called loan words, and these are, for example, priest, altar, church, bishop, and so on. This is also the time when literacy starts to become especially important, reading and writing. It was not widespread among the general population, but these new monasteries became centers of learning, culture, and manuscripts were produced, illustrated, and copied there, such as this picture, which shows the Gospel according to Matthew. So this is also the time where we have some of the earliest surviving texts in Old English, for example, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and Beowulf. Old English was much more complicated than modern English. It had 3 genders, just like German. It had 5 cases. It had 10 classes of verbs, and it had verb endings depending on number, tense, mood, and person. So a lot of this stuff has disappeared from modern English. And also it was already a very complex language with a room for a lot of variety. For example, Beowulf uses 36 different words which essentially mean hero, 20 different words which essentially mean man, 12 for battle, 11 for ship. And again, as we've seen before, many of the most basic words used today are very old. And some of the ones to come from Old English are water, earth, drink, sing, night, and so on. Many words, though, they died out because Britain was being invaded by other groups of people later on. For example, the Vikings had an influence on Old English. They started to make raids on the East Coast. For example, the monastery on Lindisfarne in 793. And a little over 50 years later, Vikings had started to overwinter in England instead of sailing home. And in 865, Vikings mounted a full-scale invasion. And so there were ongoing battles for the possession of the country. And under these pressures from battles, the 7 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms they were also sort of fighting between each other. So under these pressures, a unified kingdom of England started to emerge. And the first guy to call himself King of the Anglo-Saxons was Alfred the Great in 871. Alfred made a deal with the Vikings, defining actual borders between the English and Viking kingdoms. And the Viking territory became known as the Danelaw, because the people there lived under Danish law. But actually, Alfred the Great is often seen as saving English from destruction rather than giving up a lot of territory. For example, because he believed in educating people in English and not Latin. And we see this Danelaw area in the middle of England there. Really big chunk of territory. But this Danelaw didn't last very long, less than 100 years. But Viking invasions continued until the middle of the thousands. Viking settlement, though, had a huge impact on the Old English language. Many place names, Grimsby, literally Grimsby, Ormsby, also family names ending in son, and up to 1,000 everyday words, skull, skin, neck, and so on. And in Scots, which is the language in Scotland, actually the Scandinavian influence has been even stronger in both the way that words are pronounced, but also in the vocabulary. For example, in Scotland, the word for child is bairn, the word for church is kirk, and out is pronounced oot. So, to sum up, Old English started as a dialect spoken by the Germanic tribes in Britain. It started to develop into its own language, and it was influenced by Christianity and by the coming of the Vikings. And the monasteries were these centers of literacy, ensuring that we have texts left from back then.